Hey everybody, is MVC dead? Okay, so this exactly isn't the case. I am simply trying to put some theatrics to this presentation, but perhaps the real question is what is Flex architecture and how is it going to impact MVC? So without further ado, let's understand what is the difference between these two architectures. So we all know how MVC model works. So you've got a model, you've got a controller, and you've got view. View is your presentation layer, and controller is the controlling layer, and model is the layer where most of the data is there, and the logic stays. So the user essentially is impacting, looking at the view, putting inputs into the controller, and which is impacting the model. Now, let me explain this to you in a very simple context. Now, let's say you've got a rectangular sofa and a circular chair, perhaps, okay, and you want to swap these. So you want to move the sofa to the side and the chair to the other side. And what would you need for that? So you would need a resource, and let's say you have got one resource. So that resource first goes, picks up the sofa, keeps it aside. He then moves the circular chair onto the place where the sofa is, and then he finally moves the sofa into the place where the circular chair is. So this essentially has been a three-way exercise. So you have to have this resource, even if you have got two resources, you still have to wait until one person moves the X resource from A place and moves it to place B, and then and the other person then can come in. So this essentially, in a sense, limits the reaction time of change. So if you look at this perspective from an HTML DOM point of view, so let's say this is your document object model, which is your web page, and you want to change something in your web page. And imagine that there are millions and millions of web pages you have, and you want to change a particular component here. It becomes really expensive from a user, from a server point of view, to change each and every minute stuff. So that, however, is how the MVC model works. Okay. When you look at Flux architecture, Flux is one-dimensional, which is unidimensional operational mode. So you have an action, you have a dispatcher, and you have a store, and you have a view. So essentially, whatever action is taken by the user is sent through the dispatcher into the store, and then it's viewed. Okay, and I'll explain this in little more detail. So let's look at the same scenario. Okay, a table and a circular chair. And what in this particular scenario happens is that the architecture here kind of creates or mirrors your future state. So let's say you wanted to move the rectangular table top and the circular table below. The structure goes and creates that as a virtual model, and then that retains the virtual model without changing anything in your actual model. So the actual model remains the same, and the virtual model also remains the virtually it is available, and it can then you can then manipulate the virtual model without impacting the real model. So the real model which is there, which is your HTML DOM, it stays the way it is, but the virtual model can be manipulated. So this saves a lot of time, and you can always go back to your original view if you don't like this particular state. So it's very modular. You can move things around here within the same space, and there is not much of resource requirement here because everything is done virtually. What you see is virtual, and what you impact in behind the scenes doesn't really impact the DOM. So a bit of context on the difference between MVC and Flux. So MVC was born in 1976. It's a relatively old framework. Flux has been here only for a few years. MVC is bidirectional flow, and Flux is unidirectional. So when you talk about two-way data binding, that's what is MVC all about. Flux doesn't have two-way data binding, it has only unidirectional data binding. And this is a good thing, as you will see in the future. And data binding is key here. In Flux, it's events and action that are the main players. In MVC, the controller handles the business logic. In Flux, store does all the calculation. MVC is somewhat synchronous, and Flux is implemented completely asynchronously. MVC, of course, has been around for a very long time, so it's a trusted architecture used by a lot of companies in a lot of projects. Flux has been recently created, but Facebook claims that it helped them solve complex problems which MVC couldn't have. So Facebook has been a huge supporter of the Flux model, and in fact, the Facebook React uses Flux architecture. So let's look at the difference in terms of the model and how does it impact when there's a huge user traffic. So let's look at MVC in cases where there are large user traffic. So that's represented by view, and every time, because it is it's bi-directional, the model, the logic is staying in the model. The logic is staying in the controller. You are impacting the model at every point in time. So this makes a very complicated way of interconnecting the model and the view. And because there is bi-directional data flow, you see that some models talk to some view while some models talk to some other view. So it kind of becomes very spaghetti for a large project where you have to understand each model, each view, and go through the components specifically. Whereas in Flux, it's a very simple architecture because the logic is sitting in the store, and you're not impacting the store in any which ways, and you're pretty much, whatever changes are happening through the action process, which sort of updates the dispatcher and then again goes and renders in the view. So this is relatively simple in comparison to MVC. I want to give you a perspective of an MVC structure. So this is a typical DOM tree, and it's easy when it's like a simple DOM tree, but when you add components to it, it becomes quite complex. And this is exactly the issue, because you need to then manage different components at different points in time. And this exactly was the issue which Flux is trying to resolve through its architecture. So let's look at the issues which have been raised in various forums. So the first thing we've already discussed is that it creates several models and several views. So in the real world, when you look at different conditions, there are multiple data binding that happens, sort of creates issues. So there is a cascading effect. One component triggers multiple others. So that's and some of these are things that you cannot control. So you will impact one component and there will be a downstream impact on the other controllers which you don't perhaps want to impact, and you want it to stay the way it is. It is difficult to understand, especially when you're onboarding new developers. Say you've got a large project and there are several models and several views. It's very difficult for you to integrate that through a large team, who will have to understand each model and what does it do without impacting the other view layers. Thus, it is hard to debug. The maintainability when the scope really goes huge is difficult. So it's not really maintainable. Testing is a nightmare here for the same reason. And adding new features also becomes difficult because you do not know which particular view or component will be impacted by that, or if it will break your entire app itself. So let's look at how does Flex manage this state. So Flex has this concept of store, and it has this concept of smart component. So basically the view here is kind of a smart component, and the store is where the business logic sits, and it contains the entire apps, the state, the view, model, all of that. Okay, it's typically operating in an immutable state, and it cannot be directly manipulated. And it notifies the listener when changes occurs. So whenever there's a change occurring, it just goes and notifies the listener, which of course is the view component. And view is kind of a dumb layer and a smart layer. So you have the dumb layer which is presenting everything to the user, which is completely decoupled from the rest of the component. So it just displays whatever it is. Okay, so this is good thing because any impact in the store will not impact the dumb component or vice versa. And the smart component pretty much operates in the form that it subscribes to the store for X particular data. So if it wants that data, it subscribes and store automatically provides that data. So in that sense, it reacts to the stored state, and in itself it is stateless. It cannot change itself directly. It has to be impacted through the store, and it's kind of in that sense a pure function state. So that perhaps kind of gives you an idea of architecturally how is it different. Okay, so who's using it? As I was mentioning, the biggest sponsor for this particular architecture is of course Facebook. Facebook has React, which uses a Flux architecture. They have created an inbuilt Flux architecture which they use. So Facebook is really leading this particular way in terms of the new architectural model, and it has sort of saved them a lot of trouble while they were manipulating their DOM. And there are several libraries of Flux, and Redux is one of the best, or the number one library right now, or a framework, if you may, for Flux architecture. So Redux is very good, and Facebook React uses Flux as an architecture. So to end it, the question is, should you use it, shouldn't you use it? And the question is answered by a question which I would sort of put in as why not? Okay, because end of the day, web app do two things. They display stuff to the user and they track data. So you have to fundamentally get clarity of what you want to do in the web. It's basically displaying data from your backend to your frontend, and it's tracking that particular data. So use a tool which is the easiest to make that happen. Don't get bogged down by the fact that the architecture may be complex or simple. So really look at architecture. If I were you, I would go and choose a Flux architecture. Why not? Because it is new, and it's really sort of addressing this particular thing, which is displaying stuff to the user and tracking data. So I think that pretty much brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to put them in the comment section, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much. Have a great day.